Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I want to focus a little bit more about Material X shading, as it's still a little bit new to everyone. It's now built in obviously in Houdini using Solaris, and a lot of other render engines like Arnold or RenderMan, they all use Material X, or you can at least use them with it. So I think it's time for me to get a little bit more into shading using that. It's a little bit more atomic, meaning there's more granular low-level nodes in order to make your shading networks perform as they're supposed to. And I'll be explaining it more in a basic example in this tutorial, how to create like this 3D printed shading look. It's very simple technically, but there are a little bit of gotchas to understand in those shading networks. And while I'm explaining things, I get a little bit carried away. I go into obviously using my camera recipe. I'm going into cloning using Karma XPU, and obviously I will be also talking about the shading itself. I hope you will enjoy this one, and I'm finally getting my groove back in creating more content. As always, the scene files are uploaded to my Patreon for a subscription fee, but you get access to all my previous tutorials where you can do one-off purchases for certain scene files if you are interested in that. So without further ado, let's jump into the tutorial. Alright, we are back in Houdini, and as you can see I have a couple of references open, and I just want to find a procedural way to kind of create these kind of materials. And you can see it's pretty straightforward, I would say. There's some kind of horizontal lines going on because of the 3D print. It's essentially pretty glossy, and you've got always these fine little lines, and maybe there's some kind of breakup, some potentially based on curvature. So we will be looking into that to create some kind of pretty simple Material X shader, but Material X is a little bit more atomic, meaning there is lots more of nodes that you need to connect to get something similar. And yeah, let's get started. So let me just get maybe the references out of the way, make them a little bit smaller. I'm using PureRef, by the way, but that I guess is the default nowadays. All right, so now let's create our test geometry, which I like to use as the rubber toy for the most part. And you can see this is the material, and it has already one single shader applied. Usually I use the quick material, the new one, but for this, because we need to do it ourselves, I'm using the material library, which creates our shading networks. And it also has the ability to assign stuff right away in one little node. So diving in here, let's use a Karma material builder, and we can name this to our 3D print shader, whatever, something like that. And then on the outside, you can see it's complaining, autofill. It's looking for the material path. Maybe we cannot start with a number. Let's just do print shader, just to make sure nothing fails. Try this again, print shader assigned to geometry, and we can just drag it over. And now you can see our material assignment is gone. All right, now we don't have any light. So if I render now, we use our default headlight, which is fine, which will work just fine. And now let's get into the nitty-gritty. So open up the print shader network, and this is our default material. We have inputs and obviously our standard shader. Displacement, we will be using displacement for the most part, our standard surface shader. So obviously we can already go ahead and let's go for the blue. I think you can middle click and drag to pick a color, but it's always using a different picking LUT essentially. So it's not always exactly the sRGB color value that you're picking. But anyways, let's dial it in a little. Go more towards the blue, maybe a little bit lighter. So I would say this is kind of what we're after. You have your specular roughness if you feel like having something like that. And let's now start working with that. So the idea is to create some kind of pattern that repeats all the time. My first approach was obviously to create a ramp, and then, there's no ramps. There's just constant and a parameter. So for 20.5 or maybe for Houdini 20, this is the ramp node to go with. The thing now is, if I connect this, let's say first to our base color, just to see what it will look like, and then we don't see anything. So let's see if it works just in the render. And even that does not really work. So this was already a little bit tricky for me to get right. But the thing is, it kind of needs to know where to put it. And what I don't fully get is it says position, but the input is a float. So it's just, obviously you can't place a vector in here. So what the idea is, you create the position node, and this uses the global position data from your object in this case. And if I would plug that into my base color, you can now see this is kind of what it's doing. It's essentially a position pass, but the ramp expects a single value. So what you can do is you can use a channel extract here. Or is it just extract? So we want to just essentially get a red, green, or green component. So I use the extract node and I pipe in my vector, and now I can essentially extract the index 0, 1, 2, which would be red, green, and blue, or X, Y, and Z in this case. So I want to repeat the ramp pattern similar as you see in the references vertically, right? So now the idea is, okay, let's try to use the Y component, index number 1, input, and see if we connect this, what we get. Now it's something. Is it something? It doesn't look like anything, but let's render, and now we can see we kind of get the ramp vertically. So that is already a good step forward. And then I thought, usually the ramp nodes have some kind of way to repeat the texture, but then there is nothing. So I was already now thinking, how can we have this thing repeat? I can obviously create these patterns myself and create them, a lot of them. Maybe procedurally, I could create lots of these guys. You know, it kind of starts to repeat. If I change the mode to be linear as well, to be constant as well, then we get already kind of what I'm after. But obviously this is super tedious and I want to find a better way to do it. So the next thing then was, I thought, let's try to use the position pass and manipulate that so we have some kind of repeating pattern. All right, so now we have the position and extraction. And now my thought was, okay, let's try to just multiply the Y component. So there's like a simple Metrelix multiply node, and you can put in a value. So if I increase, multiply it, you can kind of see it does do something. And the weird thing is it kind of behaves as I would expect it when you use a noise. Like, look at it. If I use let's say a 3D noise, plug that into base color, this is the noise pattern. And if I use the position and the multiply on a noise, you can kind of see it does repeat the pattern, right? So that was my thought process. Okay, let's just do the same thing that I always do with noises. And I did that at the top here, but it did not produce me the same result. So that was a little bit odd. After a little bit of help from the CG Wiki Discord, they said, okay, let's try the modular function. Modulo is essentially, it repeats itself after a certain value, essentially. So if you put in modular in here, that's pretty much the magic. And if I plug that in here, you can now see it does repeat it. So that was already solving my issue. And now I can quite easily increase the multiply. And we get all these horizontal lines. And obviously, if you play with the ramp, you can make them 50-50, something like this. So this would be now already a very good way forward. And this essentially did all the logic for me. All right, now from this moment on, we obviously did pipe it on the base color just to see the results in a quick fashion. But now the plan is obviously to place them into the displacement. And displacement expects a float as usual. So instead of using this again, we can just use an extract one more time, plug that into input, and then we just go out with the index and put that into any channel. It's just because it's like a black and white map. It just needs a luminance value technically. If we render now, we should get displacement exploding, right? Obviously exploding. So the displacement node has a scale, so you can play with this to go very low, maybe 0.001. Yeah, you can kind of see something is bulging, maybe go factor of 10. You can now see we kind of extruding something. Now let's disable the base color. Maybe that makes it a little bit more apparent what's happening. And you can see we are getting these lines exactly how I'd expect them to look like. Obviously, they are quite jagged because Karma Works, it's using dicing similar as RenderMan is using, and probably Mantra was using as well, but Arnold was a bit different. So you have your render geometry nodes. You can plug that in here. What you can do, plug in our base geo, and then there's dicing at the bottom. Dicing quality, if you set that 0.5, let's see what we get. Not much better, still a bit jagged, so let's go maybe 0.75. It will take a little bit longer. Now you can see we're getting really nice harsh edges, and this is kind of what we're after, right? So we get this kind of effect of this pattern. Also, what we can do, which will help a little bit as well, if we go and subdivide it beforehand. And while we're doing that, let's do modify, sub-modify, I think it is. dive in here, make sure we unpack it so we can actually work with it. By default, it will pick the right object because it's right after. If I jump in here, this is now our geo. Let's add a subdivide, maybe just one time, so we go to maybe twice. Get a little bit more detail. I like to create a curvature node. This will help us to get some more detail in the shader to make it a little bit more interesting. Curvature, I guess this one. Disable visualizer, disable UV visualization. So this is our convexity look at the moment. We can play with the multiplier maybe. Now you can see we're getting some really cool stuff. We can compress the values a little bit. We can now use this as some kind of base color override to get a little bit more interesting results on this. All right, so we got this. That's now a point attribute named convexity. We can maybe copy this already in the buffer. We have it subdivided, and now we have also the dicing back in place. And now we get a little bit cleaner look. And obviously we can play with the dicing if we need to. But for now, let's hop into the shader again. And as I said, we wanted to maybe drive the base color so that we have a Primva reader pasted in here, convexity. We want to drive the base color with it. So we can do a ramp constant, and we're ramping this value, and then we extract this color and paste that or use that as my base color. Let's see how that looks. Shift R to get the render going. Disable displacement for a moment. I think that compiles the shader always a bit quicker, or at least the iterations seem to be faster. If you hit X on the ESC Primva, or if actually any node that is connected to your output, if you hit X, it actually does a preview of that node. Similar like in Arnold, you would have the view selected. So that's pretty handy. And now we can kind of fine tune the color. So I want the white stuff to be light blue and the dark stuff to be blue. So going back to our color here, let's make the base color maybe this blue. And then we can copy this value, paste value, like that. Now we've got the same blue, and then we just desat it a little bit so it gets a little bit lighter, maybe like this. And this is now our standard surface shader. At the moment we don't have any roughness, so let's actually use the same black and white map. Let's just do a remap, which allows us to change the min and max and all of that. So input, and this will plug into our specular roughness like so. We can then, as usual, visualize it. This is now our black and white map for the roughness. Technically, I think they would be the same, but just for the sake of this video, let's just have the minimum value to be 0.2 and the maximum value maybe to be 0.5 maybe. So it means that the white stuff will look rougher than the black stuff essentially. So the black is super shiny and the rest is darker. This is now our roughness. Let's maybe have a look how the shader looks with the displacement. Did I break it now? Let's disconnect properties as well, hook that up. Next input, maybe doesn't matter, it maybe knows what is what, probably it knows. We don't need properties really because we're not changing anything. Just see what we get. Okay, it looks like we get displacement, but our shader is still connected to the visualizer. All right, so now we can see we are getting the base color being white, and that looks already pretty cool. So our valleys are more shiny than our ridges, so I want to invert that. And the easiest way to do it is either by just switching these input outputs. Let's just do that. And now it should be kind of flipped. Again, it is a little bit slower as soon as you have displacement connected. Let's just visualize this. Yeah, seems like it's still working as it's supposed to. What I want to do now is I want to increase the repetition amount. So all the way back to our multiply. Let's go maybe 120 times. So we get a way finer lines here, which will also then affect the roughness by default. Maybe go a little bit more, 150. I can see that the white seems to be a lot bigger than the black. So the ramp probably needs to be a little bit bigger. Seems like that is not really updating it. So I'm now looking at the ramp output, and yeah, let's just try to just get these lines in shape, but I think now they are pretty much equal. What I do want to do, actually I did disconnect the displacement for the moment. What I do want to do is I want to maybe break up the lines a little bit. So what we can do, we have our modulo, which is now the ramp, before it's actually going into the breakup. I think it doesn't really matter, but we can just try to use a noise. Let's try a 3D noise. We want to maybe add it to our position. So I think what we want to do is do it on the modulo. Let's see, I haven't tried it before, but let's just say, so we do add, and we add input 1 with input 2. So we're essentially adding data to our position pass. And if I hook this up to my input, the noise is now very big, so nothing will really happen. So let's just use, as I showed before, the position and our multiply to add more frequency to that node. Hook that up in our position. Look at this, increase the frequency. So we are adding now these values to our position pass like this. Probably too extreme, but you can already see what it's doing. The ramp is now all messed up like this. And this is what I wanted. Obviously, as usual, always go extreme and then dial it back down. So amplitude 0, pretty clean. And now if we dial it in little by little, you can now see the pattern is not straight anymore. Maybe this is too much in terms of the amount of frequency. Let's go back a little so it's broader, maybe like this. It's a subtle thing, but I think that will help visually. Remap still works the same. Same breakup now in here. Now let's have a look how this looks once we have the displacement connected. Let's get that connected. Oh, we've got the visualizer still on. Okay, let's see. Again, we don't have any nice lighting at the moment, but let's actually try to have the same roughness just to see how that would look. Okay, the same roughness makes it a little bit more pleasing. So I think let's go maybe 0.2 and 0.3. So there's a little bit of variation between, and this actually now looks pretty nice. It looks very similar, I feel, to the reference in terms of the material response. You can see how the glossiness goes over these ridges. I think that's quite organic now. And now I would say, let's try to get some nice lighting in here and see how that goes. Go back to the stage, and this is now our material. Let's maybe frame our rubber toy by Space G. Let's create a camera. Let's go no cam, new camera. I always like to have a very long lens, maybe go 150, zoom out like that. So that kind of compresses the image. I kind of like this look. And you can already see it looks quite nice. Maybe we have a bit too much frequency on our displacement, but for now this I think works. Next step would be to create some lights, I would say. So first of all, let's just create a area light. Boom. Bring it in, everything disappears. We can move it to diffuse mode, click it, and this will now place our diffuse light. Right click, change the brightness variant to exposure. You can just Control Shift to increase exposure, whatever works for you. And then we can duplicate this and do maybe a specular placement, clicking at the back here to create some nice pings. Can play with the distance here to move it back. Guess this does not work. What is the distance? Control drag moves it back. That's really enough now, changing the intensity, which is not what it's supposed to do. So Control Shift should increase exposure, I guess. All right, I had a little crash here, so let's get going. So area light 1 is in place. Let's duplicate that for area light number 2 and enter for manipulator. Move the mode to specular. Now we can place the specs to get something interesting. And we can also play with colors. Let's maybe make the rear light red and maybe the top light some kind of warm color. Oh, actually, I like the white. Let's keep it neutral for the top light and maybe place the specular for the top light a little bit more rimmy. I like this pretty much. And now we have a little bit missing some fill light. So let's just create one more. That will be our neutral kind of fill that we want to use as a diffuse to fill in these shadows. Going back to the edit mode, making sure we are on exposure. We can now Control Shift and drag to just play with the exposure to just have it a little bit on the shadow side, just to get something a little bit more interesting here. So that's kind of the lighting aspect of this. There's a couple of things that I always like to change is crop render off, so we have a full camera here, and maybe depending what you're after, for this render, I think the light blue background works pretty well. And now I would like to use my focal camera that I created in the previous tutorial. So instead of actually using this camera, I'm just using my recipe that I saved, which is called focal camera, which then creates these 3 setups here. So I can just connect them at the bottom, go to the bottom of my scene graph here, look through our camera by just dragging this. You can already see what it's doing. It has this focal point. I can then rotate the camera as I see fit, maybe changing the focal length first, view. That's already on 200, predefined. Maybe place it as I like it. And you can see my focal point is always set. Maybe go a little bit closer. And then if we don't want to see the crosshair, we can just easily disable it under the camera too, just by disabling it like that. So now I have my focal setup as well. And I feel that my f-stop is too low. So let's go a little bit higher, something like this. This feels already pretty cool. Now it's time probably to change the shader a little bit. So if I pin this viewer, I can, actually I don't need to do that for this, but I just pinned it. So now I can change my colors slightly. Maybe the blue is too dark and we want it a little bit lighter blue, depending again what you want to achieve. And I feel that we might need to push our displacements and also the dicing to make this work a little bit better. Potentially the rest is okay. So let's go back up here and work on the dicing. This is at the moment, I think, on 0.7. Let's go on 1. Let's see if we get straighter lines. Yeah, this is now a lot more in focus. And this is kind of the idea. So now we have a fully set up system that will work pretty nice. And if you want to render different close-ups or something, you can just, it always does that, which I don't like, but you can go in closer, see what this looks like. If it's too blurry, obviously, again, go in here, change the f-stop, make that bigger, so you don't get this crazy depth of field. And I feel maybe we need to change the shader a bit. I think our frequency is still too high, so I can either leave it cooking and jump into the shading network, play with our multiplier here. Let's go maybe to 90. So we have less repetition. And now you can see it's already cleaner. Our breakup is probably too big, our noise. So let's reduce that as well. The additional amplitude here, maybe go 0.1. Let's see, the lines should now be a lot straighter. That's better. And I feel our gap is too big in the ramp. So let's make it smaller. So now this feels a little bit better. I think at this point in time, maybe the dicing is now too much. Let's actually disable the dicing that we added. And yeah, this actually works as well. So now this is our kind of little material that we created. Obviously, if you zoom out a little bit, it seems like the dicing changes, so maybe we need to have it back on. But yeah, this is the cool setup. And if you want to now do something even cooler, you can obviously now have different inputs here. So I can just use a pig head instead, and we probably need to modify and create the variables as well. Maybe use a axis align, what's it called, match size, just to get it into the origin. Something is up there. And then this would be minimum, so it moves up, and our camera is not really working. And our assignments will probably also not work. So to have all of this work properly, you would need to create a collection, pipe all of the upstream into a collection and use it like that. But let's just connect these guys in our geometries. Now that is assigned. Go back all the way down, look through our camera too. Potentially now we need to move it, render. And then this is now our look with, I'm not sure, look with this guy. Obviously this is somehow broken, probably because of our sub modify. That seems to break everything. Yeah, so I just reopened the scene, and yeah, so you can quite easily just change the geometries and the shader will just work. That's the beauty of Houdini. And if you want to go really nuts, this is something that I did to play around, is you can work with the cloning system, at least not the system, but the cloning render new tool. Pretty cool. And let me just walk you through it, because I think it's quite helpful, especially if you have like a multi-shot workflow or stuff like that. So you can create a new window. under Solaris, there's a clone control panel. It says blah, blah, blah. You can create at the top here to create a new clone. If you have a farm, you can use HQ. This will distribute the clones to different machines, or you can use a local clone and it will ask you, hey, do you want to use CPU or XPU? I want to use XPU. Hit OK. And now this essentially creates a clone. This will already launch the render. You can see it's creating a new shell and it's starting a process here at the bottom. Pretty nifty. And once it's cooked, I will show you that it's actually quite helpful. All right, now you can see that something has been rendered. You can right click here and say show and render gallery. This will present it within here. And the reason why it looks like this is because you still need to select essentially a location that you want to render from. So you can pick and say you want to render which node from the set focal distance. Things will update again. And we also would need to adjust our shader assignments that we changed. So we also would want to add the rubber toy to this long list. As I said, you technically want to use collections for this. Let's see what the clone is doing. You can now see the clone has been updated. And this is essentially now my external frame buffer, if you want to call it that. And then in the camera, we can change the, in this camera, we can change the f-stop again, maybe 0.5. So now we see a lot more blurriness going on. Again, this is an external process, so it always takes a little bit of time to update. Let's see what it looks locally. Camera 2. XPU, and this is kind of what we have locally. Let's go camera 2. And it also says it's kind of the camera is set to auto. It's always best to be specific, so let's use camera 2. And now you can see we get a matching look to what is in our viewport. So the cool thing now, what you can do now, finally I'm getting to the point, is you have the flexibility to use context variables and you can launch different renders here at the bottom. And what I mean by that is I can now, for instance, and you think of this more of a multi-shot workflow, I could now create a little switch, hook this up in here. So it has now 2 inputs, 0 and 1. For now, I can maybe pause the syncing. Now, based on the input, let's go back to stage. That was my mistake. This should be stage. Based on the input, you can obviously now go to the pig head or the other geo, like that. And I want to drive this with a variable. So I can go now to my context options here, context options editor, and I could just easily create a new number in slider. Probably would do it. Or I'm not sure if this will work, but we'll see. Let's just call this asset. The input is also named asset like this. And now if I can go to 1 and 2, and you can see now the switch is working based on this context variable. And in our clone control panel, you can go, where was it? Here, add context option column. You can just name this asset name or whatever, or just asset the same way. This is just a string. All the way to the right, you can now see we have this new asset column. And for instance, I can now force this to be 0 or 1. In this case, if I put this to 1, unpause it, we should now see that the asset is driving a different variable and it should switch to the pig head. I think I have the asset name needs to be all caps. And then because I changed the name differently, so let's try all caps. Control panel, let's see if this works. Yeah, so what I did, I went to the edit context option and just made sure this is lowercase and then changed the input also to lowercase, and now it works. So if I change the type now to asset 0, it now switches to the rubber toy, and if it's on 1, it switches to the pig head. And now the cool thing is I can right click this and say duplicate clone 1. I can change it to be 0. And now this clone is about to be launched as well. And now I have 2 live renders actually that runs the assets on for my shot, let's say. Yeah, so now you can see these are both live renders. Obviously the camera is still a little bit out of place. So if I place it now, you can see they both update as I would expect them to. And if I want to change lights, this is now all live on the fly. Let's change the color for the kick light, maybe to something green. And you can see that is updated as well for both renders at the same time. And you can see that we don't have we do not have denoising in this instance. So what I want to do, I want to create a render settings node, render settings, drop that in here. Make sure that we have our, let's say we can disable motion blur, image output, filter. We can enable the denoiser as well. And then change it to XPU. Make sure our render camera is number 2, and now this should hopefully update properly, and it should have the denoising now enabled as well. And now I just moved this camera render settings node to the bottom and changed the render node to my camera render settings, and now you can see that everything is denoised nicely. I think for testing it's always maybe good to keep it low, the sampling I mean. So now we're using 32 samples. This should be all a little bit snappier as well. So that's pretty nice. And you can obviously do a lot with these cloning. You can also obviously see your render settings, which is nice if you need to have them on the fly. What I meant to say is potentially that using a multi-shot workflow, you can have all sorts of different context switches, switch between different render cameras, and have a really nice setup. And I will be talking about that in a future tutorial more in depth, how to create a proper multi-shot workflow. So anyways, thank you everyone for watching this extended video on the Material X shading, but I went a little bit overboard, but I hope you still enjoyed that, and I will see you guys in the next video.